That's what you're paid for, office boy. Now fetch me another martini." Victoria Harrington's voice dripped with disdain as she snapped her manicured fingers at me, her designer dress glittering under the chandeliers of the Riverside Country Club. The CEO's wife had just dismissed me like hired help at the company's 25th anniversary gala, in front of 200 employees, board members, and their spouses. I was Marcus Chen, 38 years old, senior financial analyst at Harrington Industries, and I'd been quietly orchestrating the most elaborate corporate takeover in the company's history for the past 18 months. I smiled politely, nodded once, and walked to the bar. "2 martinis extra dry," I told the bartender, my voice steady as marble. What Victoria didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except my lawyer and my accountant, was that while she was treating me like the help, I owned 47% of her husband's company. By market close tomorrow, I'd own 52%, and her husband would be working for me. My name is Marcus Chen. I graduated summa cum laude from Wharton with dual degrees in finance and economics. For 12 years, I'd been the invisible backbone of Harrington Industries, the person who actually understood the numbers while CEO Robert Harrington played golf and his wife spent money they didn't have. Tonight, watching Victoria humiliate me for the entertainment of Hartford's elite, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, something colder, more precise. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. The signs had been there for months. Robert's increasingly erratic spending, the company's deteriorating fundamentals, Victoria's extravagant lifestyle that seemed to expand regardless of quarterly performance. While they lived like royalty, they'd been slowly bleeding the company dry through consulting fees to shell companies. Victoria had established executive bonuses that bore no relation to performance, and real estate purchases that somehow benefited their personal portfolio more than the company's. I'd discovered it all 18 months ago while preparing the annual audit. Buried in complex transactions and carefully worded board resolutions was a systematic looting operation. The Harringtons weren't just overpaid executives, they were actively embezzling from their own company. That's when I stopped being an employee and started being an investor. I met Robert Harrington in 2012 when I was recruited away from Goldman Sachs to modernize Harrington Industries' financial operations. The company manufactured specialized industrial equipment, profitable but stagnant, with Robert having inherited it from his father. I was 26, hungry, and impressed by the opportunity to shape a company's financial strategy from the ground up. For the first 5 years, everything worked. I streamlined operations, identified new revenue streams, and built financial models that helped the company grow from $150 million to $400 million in annual revenue. Robert took credit for the growth while I worked 18-hour days and took minimal vacation. I didn't mind. I was learning, earning, and building something meaningful. The problems started when Victoria entered the picture. She married Robert in 2017, a former pharmaceutical sales rep with expensive tastes and no understanding of business fundamentals. Within 6 months, the company's expense structure began expanding dramatically. Executive development trips to Monaco, strategic consulting contracts with firms nobody had heard of, and a suspicious pattern of real estate investments that always seemed to benefit the Harringtons personally. I started noticing discrepancies in quarterly reports. Revenue growth was slowing, but executive compensation was accelerating. Board meetings became perfunctory affairs, where Robert presented my analysis while Victoria sat in the back, playing on her phone, and occasionally making dismissive comments about boring financial stuff. The first real warning came last Christmas when Victoria loudly complained at the company party that I was overpaid for a number cruncher and suggested Robert hire someone younger and cheaper. She said it within earshot of 3 board members, laughing like it was a joke. I smiled and nodded, but that night I went home and started researching the legal mechanisms for acquiring controlling interest in a publicly traded company. What I discovered was that Robert and Victoria had been systematically selling their company shares to fund their lifestyle. From 2018 to 2023, their combined ownership had dropped from 61% to 31%. The shares were dispersed among small institutional investors, pension funds, and individual shareholders, none holding more than 3% individually. It was a perfect setup for a stealth acquisition by someone who understood the company's real value and had the patience to execute a long-term strategy. I began by approaching disgruntled former employees who still held shares. Tom Morrison, the former head of engineering who'd been forced out when Victoria decided his department was too expensive, owned 2.3% of the company. Sarah Kim, the former marketing director who'd quit after Victoria undermined her in every meeting, controlled another 1.8% through her retirement fund. One by one, I built relationships with shareholders who'd been burned by the Harringtons' management style. I offered fair market value for their shares, always slightly above current trading price, and never bought more than 1% from any single source to avoid triggering disclosure requirements. Meanwhile, I used my position inside the company to document every financial irregularity, every questionable transaction, every example of corporate waste. I built an airtight case that the company was being mismanaged and undervalued, ammunition I'd need when I eventually revealed my position. The breakthrough came 6 months ago, when I discovered that Victoria had established 3 consulting companies that existed solely to bill Harrington Industries for services never rendered: Meridian Strategic Solutions, Pinnacle Business Development, and Summit Executive Services, all registered to post office boxes, all with Victoria listed as the beneficial owner buried in the complex corporate structures. These shell companies had invoiced Harrington Industries for $2.3 million over 18 months for strategic consulting, market analysis, and executive coaching. Not a single deliverable existed for any of these contracts. It was straight embezzlement, hidden behind corporate formalities that Robert rubber-stamped without reading. That's when I accelerated my acquisition timeline and started borrowing against my own assets to purchase larger blocks of shares. My Goldman Sachs connections helped me structure the financing, and my detailed analysis of the company's true value convinced a private equity contact to provide additional capital in exchange for a minority stake in my holding company. By the time of tonight's anniversary gala, I controlled 47% of Harrington Industries through a web of shell companies, limited partnerships, and carefully structured transactions that had never triggered SEC disclosure requirements. I was 3 percentage points away from controlling interest, and I'd identified the shareholders who would sell me those final shares for the right price at the right moment. Victoria's performance tonight had provided that moment. As I carried her martini back across the country club dining room, I watched her holding court with the other executives' wives, gesticulating with her $80,000 Hermes bag, and complaining about how hard it was to find good help these days. She was talking about household staff, but her eyes kept drifting to me as I approached, making sure everyone understood that the company's senior financial analyst was just another servant in her social hierarchy. Finally, she said when I handed her the glass, "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost. Maybe next time Robert should hire someone who can follow simple directions." The wives laughed on cue. I smiled politely and returned to my table, where I spent the next hour watching Victoria disparage various employees while Robert nodded along, too drunk or too cowardly to check his wife's behavior. At 11:47 p.m., I excused myself and stepped outside to make a phone call. "David, it's Marcus. Execute the final purchases tonight." "Yes, all of them. Have the paperwork ready for tomorrow morning's board meeting." The next morning at 8:11 a.m., I walked into the Harrington Industries headquarters carrying a leather briefcase and wearing my best suit. I'd slept exactly 4 hours but felt more awake than I had in years. Today, everything changed. Robert was in his corner office looking hungover and irritated. Victoria sat across from his desk, still wearing last night's jewelry and complaining about the awful people at the party. They both looked up when I knocked on the doorframe. "Marcus," Robert said wearily, "I hope you're not here to complain about last night. Victoria was just having fun. You know how these events can be." "Actually," I said, settling into the chair beside Victoria, "I'm here to discuss a change in corporate governance." I opened my briefcase and removed a stack of documents. As of market close yesterday, I control 52% of Harrington Industries common stock. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for 10 a.m. to address several issues with current management. The color drained from Robert's face. Victoria looked confused, glancing between us like we were speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible," Robert stammered. "The filing requirements, you can't just—" "I can, and I did." I slid the SEC filing across his desk. Everything was perfectly legal. I've been acquiring shares for 18 months. always staying below disclosure thresholds until yesterday's final purchases. Victoria finally spoke. What does this mean? I turned to her with the same polite smile I'd worn while fetching her drink. It means, Mrs. Harrington, that I now own this company. Your husband works for me. The emergency board meeting lasted 47 minutes. I presented my analysis of the company's financial mismanagement, the documented evidence of embezzlement through shell companies, and my plan for restructuring operations to maximize shareholder value. The board, most of whom had been frustrated with Robert's leadership for years, voted unanimously to accept my recommendations. Robert Harrington was terminated as CEO, effective immediately. Victoria's consulting companies were dissolved, and all payments to them were referred to the SEC for investigation. The company's legal department was instructed to pursue full recovery of embezzled funds, including personal assets purchased with company money. I was elected as the new CEO, with a mandate to restore the company's financial health and pursue aggressive growth strategies that had been neglected under the previous management. Robert sat in stunned silence as the board members filed out, each stopping to congratulate me on my acquisition and express their relief at the change in leadership. Victoria kept asking what was happening, whether this was legal, whether their lawyers could stop it. When we were alone in the boardroom, Robert finally spoke. How long have you been planning this? 18 months, I replied. Since I discovered what you and Victoria were doing to the company. The consulting fees, he said quietly. The consulting fees, the inflated executive compensation, the real estate deals that somehow always benefited your personal portfolio. I gathered my papers. You were bleeding this company dry while the employees who actually created value watched their retirement funds shrink. Victoria finally understood. You can't do this to us. Robert built this company. Actually, Mrs. Harrington, Robert inherited this company from his father. I built it into what it became over the past 12 years. You've spent the last 6 years tearing it down. I stood up, straightening my tie. Security will escort you both from the building. You have until close of business today to return any company property in your possession. What about severance? Robert asked. My contract? Your contract was voided when the board discovered the embezzlement. You're lucky I'm not having you arrested. As they gathered their things, Victoria turned to me one last time. This is because of last night, isn't it? Because I hurt your little feelings? I shook my head. Last night was just confirmation that I was doing the right thing. This was always about the company, Mrs. Harrington. You just made it personal. 6 months later, Harrington Industries had its most profitable quarter in company history. The financial restructuring eliminated wasteful spending, while strategic investments in R&D and operations increased efficiency by 23%. Stock price doubled. Employee satisfaction surveys showed the highest scores in company history. Robert and Victoria faced federal charges for embezzlement and securities fraud. Their assets were frozen pending the criminal investigation. The consulting company scheme unraveled completely when investigators discovered they'd been using similar tactics with 3 other companies where Robert had served on advisory boards. I kept the company's original name as a tribute to the founder, Robert's father, who'd built something worth preserving. But everything else changed. The country. Club membership was canceled. The executive retreats in Monaco became training seminars in Cleveland. The marble lobby was renovated into an employee break room with subsidized meals. On the first anniversary of my takeover, the company held its annual party at the same country club where Victoria had called me office boy. This time, I was the one giving the speech, thanking our employees for their dedication and announcing the largest profit-sharing bonuses in company history. As I looked out at the crowd, the engineers, the accountants, the administrative staff who actually made the company function, I thought about Victoria's words that night. That's what you're paid for. She was right, in a way. I was paid to serve the company's mission, its employees, its shareholders, and its customers. The difference was that I understood service as stewardship, not servitude. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's simply proving that you're better at their job than they ever were. The last I heard, Victoria was working as a hostess at a chain restaurant in Tampa, and Robert was selling insurance door to door. They'd both learned, a little too late, that calling someone office boy doesn't make them one. It just reveals who's really in charge. Epilogue. 5 years later, I was reviewing quarterly projections in my corner office, the same one Robert had once occupied, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Chen, there's someone here to see you. Says it's personal." I looked up from my laptop to see Victoria Harrington standing in my doorway. 5 years had changed her dramatically. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple black dress that had seen better days. The perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. The manicured nails were short and unpolished. She looked older, tired, but somehow more real than she'd ever been in the country club days. "Victoria," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "This is unexpected." She sat down carefully, clutching a worn leather purse. "I know you probably don't want to see me, Marcus, but I needed to come. What can I do for you?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "I wanted to apologize for that night at the party, for everything." I set down my pen and studied her face. "That was a long time ago. Not to me." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've thought about that night every day for 5 years. The way I treated you, the things I said. I was horrible. Through my office windows, I could see the factory floor where our employees were assembling the latest generation of industrial equipment. Harrington Industries now employed 200 people, up from 800 when I'd taken over. We'd opened 2 new facilities, and our employee satisfaction scores consistently ranked in the top 5% nationally. "Why now?" I asked. "Why come here after all this? Time?" Victoria looked up, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine remorse. "Because I finally understand what Robert and I did to this place, to these people, to you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a newspaper clipping. It was from last month's Hartford Business Journal, announcing that Harrington Industries had been named Employer of the Year for the 3rd consecutive time. "I read about the scholarship program you started," she continued. "The one for employees' children, and the profit sharing, the health clinic you built on site." She set the clipping on my desk. Robert's father would have been proud. I remembered Harold Harrington, Robert's father, who'd died 2 years before I joined the company. From everything I'd heard, he'd been a decent man who'd built the business on the principle that taking care of your employees meant they'd take care of your customers. He taught Robert those values. I said quietly. "Robert just forgot them somewhere along the way." "We both did." Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "I turned him into someone his father wouldn't have recognized, and I convinced myself that people like you, people who actually worked, were beneath us." She stood up, smoothing down her dress. "I'm not here asking for anything, Marcus. Not a job, not money, nothing like that. I just needed you to know that I understand now. What you did, taking over the company, exposing what we were doing, you saved this place. And you?" I asked. "How are you doing?" A small, sad smile crossed her face. "I work at a diner in Clearwater. 2 jobs, actually. Hostess during the day, bookkeeper at night. Robert and I divorced 3 years ago. He blamed me for everything, and maybe he was right." She paused at the door. "The people I work with now, they're good people, honest people. They work hard for everything they have, and they don't look down on anybody. I'm learning how to be like them." "Victoria," I called as she turned to leave. She looked back. "There's a woman named Sarah Kim who runs our HR department now. She heads up our second chance hiring program for people who've made mistakes and want to start over. If you ever decide you want to come back to Hartford." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "After everything I did to her, to everyone here?" "Sarah believes in redemption," I said. "So do I. That doesn't mean forgetting the past, but it might mean building something better from it." She nodded, unable to speak, and walked away. I never saw Victoria again, but Sarah told me 6 months later that she'd received a letter of recommendation for someone applying to our program. It was from a diner manager in Clearwater, praising his bookkeeper's work ethic and integrity. The applicant's name was Victoria Morrison. She'd taken back her maiden name. Sarah hired her for an entry-level position in accounts receivable. I never interfered, never checked up on her progress, but I'd occasionally see her name on company directories, slowly working her way up through merit and dedication. Last I checked, she was a senior accountant, respected by her colleagues for her attention to detail and her genuine care for the company's mission. Some people would say I should have turned her away, that what she and Robert did was unforgivable. Maybe they're right. but I'd learned something in those 5 years running the company. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so good, so strong, so worthwhile that even your enemies want to be part of it. Robert never came back. I heard he'd moved to Arizona, remarried, and found modest success selling commercial real estate. He seemed to have learned to live within his means, though I doubted he'd learned much else. As for me, I'd discovered that running a company was infinitely more satisfying than merely analyzing one. Every quarterly report that showed growth, every employee who bought their first house with profit-sharing money, every innovation that made our customers more successful, it all meant something in a way that my old spreadsheets never had. The boy who'd been told to fetch drinks had become the man who decided the company's future. But more importantly, I'd become someone who understood that true power isn't about humiliating others. It's about lifting them up. On quiet Sunday mornings, I'd sometimes walk through the factory floor, looking at the photos on the employee recognition wall, graduations, weddings, new babies, retirements after long careers, real lives made better by honest work and fair treatment. That was my real revenge, proving that calling someone office boy doesn't diminish them. It just reveals the character of the person doing the calling, and sometimes, if you're patient enough and principled enough, it gives you the chance to show them what they could have been all along.